So for the rest of the semester, we're going to be creating a custom typeface. So I know last week you all started thinking about this, but I wanted to give you a little bit more to be inspired by and also just some more information that might be really useful. So you can design a typeface using different strategies. You can draw by hand and transfer it onto the computer and then vectorize those drawings, and that can be your typeface. You can use another font as a base and make changes to that font. You can use a type design program. You can use Illustrator, or you can create what I'll call conceptual type, where you do something interesting and then you photograph uh, the the elements, and then you bring those into the computer and you vectorize and you manipulate. Or you can just create something entirely original in Illustrator. And so there's so many different ways to do this that you really need to think about what you want to design and what you want to create for this project. So I love this cleverness of this, where you see that the uppercase letters are kind of creating the lowercase letters, and it's creating a whole, if you look right here, there's like a whole secondary alphabet going on. Very cool. So I'm just going to show you some images to get inspired by. This was done using, obviously, like different grains and vegetables and fruits. Very fun, and it was done for an advertising campaign for Michael Pollan's. This is all clothing, sort of shaped into letter shapes. These are wood shavings. And this is just a hand-drawn option, where these were hand-drawn and then brought into Illustrator and vectorized, and you can see the uppercase and the lowercase versions of them. You can do some cool stuff, like if you're pretty good at Photoshop and you want to create something cool using filter effects in Photoshop, you can also do that. I would like you to have a really strong concept sort of sketched out before you do this digitally. So it doesn't mean that you can just jump to the computer. I want to kind of get a sense of, before you start this, you're going to need to sketch out ideas and think. These were fonts designed on a grid of squares, and it kind of looks back to the 1910s and 1920s, when avant-garde designers made experimental typefaces out of simple geometric parts. And they're also kind of speaking to the structure of digital technologies. And this typeface was designed on a grid of dots. And in a little while, I'll show you some images where you can see how that can be done using little elements that you create in Illustrator. This is an example of conceptual type. So obviously, these are all photographs creating this really interesting alphabet out of different shapings of the hand. So this is an option for you. You'll have to work a little differently if you choose this option, but it's there's been some really cool typefaces designed doing this in this class, so I can show you a few of those. This was a typeface done with crayons, and the process, you can see, was to use a board and stick the crayon tips through the board, and there were different colors involved, and it became super cool. But it's almost like a sculptural element once it's finished. And here's sort of a close-up of it. Handmade type or hand-drawn type is a great strategy. And so you can see this is very cool. This is also sort of a conceptual idea where these letter shapes were created. And you can see this kind of sketching process here with the hands. And then there was actually photographs done of hands, and the letter shapes that were drawn were sort of placed on top in Photoshop, and then the whole alphabet emerged. This is another really cool idea, using this sort of netting over these letter shapes. And this was that hand one with the alphabet. And you can see how cool it is. So there's so many different ideas. This is eggs. I don't know, this seems pretty messy to me, and I don't know if with this pandemic going on, you can find eggs. enough eggs to do this, but it's a very cool idea. Just basically the letter shapes were drawn out, and then they had to be very large, obviously, because eggs aren't tiny, and then they were photographed. These are pennies. You can kind of see the process here. So there's so many different ideas that you can do. You can, in this example, you see that there are these letter shapes created, and then to sort of make them more grid-based and easier to sort of look at, the artist sort of circled them in these frames that made them easier to see and sort of analyze. This is done with these, I think they're just these little ribbons shaped into letter forms. This is very cool, using these tiny little symbols and then building these symbols into letter shapes. This is sort of conceptual. You see the American face, the Spanish face, the Thai face, and then the typeface, which is kind of funny where there's no letter shape there. Okay, so I wanted you just to think about different strategies, different ideas. Sometimes typefaces are designed as sort of a homage to something. So this is example Bruno Munari, who was Italian designer, artist, sculptor. He did a lot of different things, but this was sort of a homage to his work. This was done using, you can kind of see these almost sculptural elements created out of paper that created shadows. And so it's called paper shadow typography. And it's really quite beautiful. So you can see in this example, this is Mercury Bold, which it's a page proof done by Jonathan Hoffler. And Mercury is a typeface designed for modern newspapers whose production demands fast, high volume printing on cheap paper. And so the letter forms feature these chunky serifs and sturdy upright strokes. And you can see all the notes below. And so there's a lot of, once the design occurred, there's a lot of comments, everything from width, weight of the letter, size and shape of a serif. And then you're sort of going to just adjust each variant based on these comments. This is Castaways. And it was kind of a collaborative effort. Andy Cruz, Ken Barber. It's a fun font, and you can kind of see it's drawn out on this graph paper. And I always think it's better, especially with a font like this, to start out with a physical drawing. And then once you get to the computer, there's different ways to work. Like you can use your drawing as a reference. So if your drawing is really clean and beautifully done, you can basically vectorize that drawing and then create the type that way. Otherwise, you can do strategies like redrawing the letter shapes in Illustrator, using the drawing as a reference template. And in this particular font, these were done using pencil drawings by hand, and then they were digitized and outlines were created. And Castaways is from a series of typefaces based on commercial signs from Las Vegas. And the shapes of the letters sort of recall the hand-painted strokes made by traditional sign painters and lettering artists. So that was sort of the concept behind this. So find inspiration. That's really what I want you to do. View and study as many typefaces as possible. Collect samples of type that move you, that interest you. And then sketch. Really the beauty of sketching is that there isn't a sense of commitment. You can crank out loads of ideas very quickly. You don't have to be worried about what your sketches look like. They don't have to be perfect. They can be very rough. And then once you have direction, you're going to pick a few characters and try to figure out some specific characteristics that you'll then apply to the rest. And the characters that are good to start out with first are lowercase a, e, g, n, or d. Or you can also try a few capitals, A, E, G, M. And from these characters, it will give you sort of a good variety of forms that you can base all the other letters on. Or you can use a font design program. There's different font design programs out there where you create an account and then you follow steps. You're usually given a template to build your font. There's often a tutorial, and then you build a few letters, and then you can view your font. So FontStruct is one. I can give you some recommendations for others as we kind of go along in the class, but you don't have to do this. You can just use Illustrator. If you were to really create the font and make it into a font that you're going to use and type with, then you would need to use one of these programs. There's lots of different programs out there. Yourfonts.com is one, and so these are some examples of those fonts that were created in that program. Or another strategy is to choose an existing font and alter it, and you usually want to do this in Adobe Illustrator, and this is an example. Or you can do some really clever, interesting things. So for example, in this font, these were the original vectors that were then sort of overlapped and copied, overlaid on top of each other. They were colorized. And then the K is a letter shape, just Helvetica New Bold was used. And then these graphical elements were laid on the shape, and the shape was used as a mask to sort of create the letter shape using the original vectors. So we can do this in the class. It's not that difficult. You'd have to really maybe draw out ideas first, and then you would draw them in Illustrator, and we would use this masking technique if you wanted to create letter shapes this way. You always want to also have a good idea of what the name is. You're in this project, you are going to name your font, and that's going to be important because I want the name to be significant. It should have some conceptual information that really kind of ties into the ideas behind your font. And you want to then think about the logistics, the X height, the cap height, the ascenders. So for this next part of the project, after you're done sketching and researching and you're starting to build your digital grayscale roughs in the next week or two, you're going to lay these out with a grid in Illustrator, and you're going to have the grid lines kind of specify the baseline, the X height, the cap height, the ascender, and the descender. So I'm just going to show you some examples. Like I said, start with your base letters, and that will really speed up the design process. And, you know, I is a great letter because if you start with I, then you can derive H from it, and then you can build up a string of letters. And a string of letters is you know, can be any letters you want, but this is sort of an example of one. The HAMB, hamburger, font, sieve is one. And it's just kind of showing how those letters look stringed next to each other in either lowercase or uppercase. So how are you going to build your font? One way is to hand draw type, scan onto the computer, vectorize it, and then sort of tweak and manipulate in Illustrator. So that's a really great way to work. Your final font, when you display it, is going to include both the title of the font and a pangram. A pangram is a sentence containing every letter of the alphabet. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog is a pangram. So it's just an example of a sentence that includes a lot of different letters, and a pangram is specifically every letter of the alphabet. So I want you can use any pangram you want, and there's lots that you can look up online, but that will be part of the final process. But you don't have to think about that right in the beginning stages. That's something you're going to think about as you sort of go towards the end, because you're going to eventually design sort of a poster that promotes and makes us excited about your font or your typeface. A pangram, so it's a sentence containing every letter of the alphabet, and this is another example of one, and this is kind of laid out in that original font that was vectorized. So another way to work is to use sketches as reference and then go to Adobe Illustrator and completely redraw all of the letter shapes. So that's a great way to work also, using those sketches only as reference. Or you can use that third party like fontstruct.com, and you can both use a hand-drawn font or fonts created in Illustrator for that. So, or typeface that you would design and create in Illustrator. So if you're going to use a program like that, you might need to look into it a little bit, but there's lots of different options. So this is an example of a hand-drawn font scanned, and then the letters were placed in fontstruct.com, and the font's name is Dirty Ghetto. So remember, there's lots of different ways that you can design your font. You're thinking about it now. You've done hopefully some sketching and some research, and you have sort of an idea of what you're doing. So let me know how I can help, and we can work during lab, and you can kind of get some technical help. If you have a really strong idea but you're not quite sure how to do it, reach out to me, and I can help you maybe strategize how you can do the project. If you're doing a conceptual type, there's just so many different ways that you can approach that. Last year, I think I told you about this, but there was a woman that did a whole font with her hair, and she kind of designed strands of hair into different letter shapes. And then she photographed it, and then she brought it into Illustrator, and she vectorized the photographs and created a really kind of cool, interesting font with it. So there's just lots of different approaches to this. So just reach out if you have any questions.